been welcomed to the stand, Pierre Emery.
Guys, I'm going to be really, I was obviously here for the first two presentations that came through, and I want to just give you a warning in this context, is that my presentation is different to all the context. Is that really when they asked me to come and have a conversation today, it was not going to be around the technical aspects of Bitcoin or about the cryptocurrency or the merits thereof. It was really around, because as a peer-to-peer lender, as we are as Rainfin, a peer-to-peer lender in the South African environment, we set out to dramatically disrupt the banking network. And we started out in 2012, and we really were sitting in rooms like this out to disrupt banking. And in 2014, we were acquired by Barclays Africa. So in that context, we have, they didn't acquire all of our business, so they acquired a significant majority stake. So now technically I'm having a conversation with you about the banking industry and how peer-to-peer lending and Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is going to affect the banking industry. So because sometimes the banking executives see my presentations, I'm going to tell you stuff which I'm not going to do in the presentations context. So we have that kind of conversation. So these points are all my own, not necessarily the point of the Barclays Africa group at all. So it was very interesting because the topic that they came forward when they first had a discussion was, would we come and have a conversation about, are we going to completely disrupt traditional banks with these two elements, with ultimately, of course, with cryptocurrency, let's call it Bitcoin for now, and with peer-to-peer lending. And we've got an interesting answer as we go through it, but of course, deeply in my heart, I believe, of course, why would we have started this thing? We want to destroy these monsters. But obviously, we've got some realities about how we get through it. So I loved this before when we came through, and the first time I ever saw this, actually it comes from another digital bank that's based in the UK, in Europe. But I believe in the future, people think that we will see no bank, we will hear no bank, and we will speak no bank. I think as we go through this presentation, you'll see there's always going to be a role, but this is obviously where we're all striving to. Ultimately, we still need loans, and we still need to move and store value for the financial systems to arrive. So peer-to-peer networks or peer-to-peer lending, now let's be very specific. So lots of you, when I talk about a peer-to-peer network, you talk about the actual movement of the currency. When I talk about peer-to-peer, I'm going to talk about it in the context of people-to-people lending to each other as opposed to moving of capital to each other. And cryptocurrency, I'll talk about that in terms of people actually doing the currency before we go through. So I think before we start, if we're going to address this industry and someone's going to say to me the topic is, will you disrupt banking? I first got to answer the question of what is banking? And I think this is, it sounds like a stupid question ultimately, but we have to know exactly what it does and how it does what it does if we are going to disrupt it as we go forward. So the first and foremost, banks equal deposits. And I think this is the main context of the whole banking network, and specifically, it's the issue around the regulations that govern the networks. So when we talk about a regulator or a banking license, someone says to me, do you have a banking license as Rainfin? And I say to them, there's two contexts. As a peer-to-peer lender, or as someone who is going to go into the context of lending anything to one another. So I can lend, of course we can use Bitcoins as the currency we lend to each other. But if we're going to be a lender, we don't take deposits if we don't need a banking license. So regulators start to interfere with you as soon as you are deemed to be taking deposits. The next question they ask is, do you have a wallet? But yes, but the wallet's only there used to store stuff while it moves from one party to the other. So they say, well, does the wallet take some money from a different storage, and do you hold it in the wallet? And we say, yes, we do. Well, they say, well, then you're a bank, so you've got to be regulated because you've taken deposits. Ultimately, first of all, let's go through and say, well, the first thing about a bank is it takes deposits. The next thing a bank does is does transactions. So clearly, I've got the money into an account, and it moves that money from one party to the other. And the next is the bank does the lending. Ultimately, if we search on Google, when we go through a Google search, in the context, I'm going in the wrong direction, sorry, man. A financial establishment that invests money, deposits money, pays out when required, and makes loans, interest, and exchanges. So, we all hear, Vinny was very interesting when I had this conversation with him this morning. He believes that he can transfer, in essence, a notional value from one Walmart in South Africa to another Walmart that sits in the US. So someone's in essence they've given Walmart some money, and someone in this context here is going to have to buy some goods in the context, not through that. So when the regulators look at that world and they look at it and they say, well, has someone actually accepted a deposit? Has someone actually taken some cash? This is always the thing that underpins most of these transactional. And the second thing is, has anyone earned any interest on the money while it was deposited? So have you paid someone for the use of their money? And when the money was yours, could you use that money and loan it to anybody else? I think a lot of people who build wallets, and specifically, in essence, who build exchanges for the Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, they stay very far away from those worlds of giving somebody interest while they hold that currency for them inside the wallet. The minute we start moving into that world of always starting to pay someone a little bit of interest that's sitting outside the wallet that's there, or to use it to lend to someone else, we're entering into a different regulatory framework as we go through it. Those are very important elements as we go forward. So if this is the banking industry, I mean, clearly you guys know, if you look at this banking industry, that the entire industry is under attack. Every single aspect of it is. I mean, we did this analysis. So this comes back from a slide which sits in, this is the Wells Fargo internet banking sites. What they do is they just took all the different elements of it and all the players that are working around the industry that are attacking this particular banking monster. So now this is a presentation that we had in one of the banking excos, and we looked at it and the guy said, well, is the banking industry going to be disrupted? So when you look at this, I mean, clearly it is. I mean, every single aspect of what banks do is now becoming under attack. So not only is it the currency pieces, not only is it transfer of money pieces, but obviously also the lending pieces that are coming under attack. So most and foremost now, what, however, are the pillars we think that the banks can have, which is perhaps not going to come under as much attack as we go forward? So there's two fundamental pillars when you look at this banking network that we have to be careful about as a collective industry. I'm talking here about peer-to-peer lenders, and in essence I'm talking about transactional movement of money, the currency, how we move money from one party to the other. If we can attack those two core pillars of banking, then I think that we can really significantly disrupt the banking world. So I went ahead and when we started our lending, peer-to-peer lending businesses, we said first and foremost, if we can create a better alternative for people to lend money to one another and remove that friction, are we therefore going to take out a huge slice of the banking world? So also in our world, obviously yes, we're targeting that particular space. A lot of people who are here, obviously you guys around the Bitcoin environment and obviously the cryptocurrency, are taking the other piece, which is this movement of money element, the transactional fees business. That transactional fees business, if we start taking that business out, you clearly start having elements of disruption. Those are the two, in essence, foundational pillars of it. Yes, wealth management and all the other aspects that you saw around that graph of Wells Fargo. But deep in the heart of the banking industry are those two elements, lending and transactions. So I mean, when I walked in here, I kind of felt that there was this sort of feeling in the room, right? That let's start with the bankers ultimately, and let's start with the regulators and start with the governments. But if we look through it, if we have a look and a view and say, what is disruption? So we now know what the industry is. The industry is obviously the banking sector. And what is the disruption we're trying to have? So I like to look at this guy. And this guy, in essence, Clayton Christensen, who drives a lot of the stuff that I do in terms of the thinking about how we get real disruption services. He wrote an article which says, if you displace an existing market, so you can, of course, just change an existing market, which perhaps is what we're doing, where we are ultimately just moving money. But if you displace the market and the industry and the technology, then you have created disruption. So the first sign of disruption that's starting to happen, obviously this happened quite some time ago, but the very first sign is the technology disruption. So Napster was a technology disruption to the music industry, right? But Napster died. Ultimately, it became reborn and went through its whole services. But it was an indication that there was disruption on the horizon. It also caused an issue because it was first and fundamentally, it was a technology disruption. It was this MP3 and the ability to transfer this MP3. The next element was a business model revolution. So free, ultimately. And those two factors combined together to destroy it. But in essence, Napster didn't work in its old context. But the context of the music industry was changed ever because of it. And the music industry still survived, and very importantly, surviving because they're adopting elements of that technology into their core elements of their business. They now use MP3s, they use streaming, and ultimately use advertising-supported content. So we haven't necessarily seen an industry die, we've seen an industry change. This is the important place where we go through it. So the combination of these two, when you have technology and disruption of business model, then you create a significant industry disruption. So to be very factual, when people ask me this question is, are you going to disrupt the bank? Are you going to destroy the bank? I said, well, let's look at the banking income statements. So here it is. I mean, this is the revenue. This is generic revenue of where it comes from. And I sit down and I say to the exco that comes through the banking exco, you generate 65% of your revenue from what they call net interest income. In other words, they borrow money from somebody as a deposit, and they lend that money to someone else at a profit, and they make this gap in between. So 5%, in South African context, 5% for your deposits and 15% for your loan. So they make that money sitting in the middle. The next piece of all these other elements, there's this element that sits in there, which is ultimately transactional fees. Here it's called services charges, loan fees. So there's an other that's inside it. So there's this piece of transactional income. In a South African context, some of the banks have even higher. So you almost have 40% of the revenue coming from what they call non-interest income. So non-interest income. Basically, the ability is to move money from one aspect to the other. So one thing I can say for sure, I'm going to take these two independent experts. Let's say, if we can dry up the banking revenues from the banks, have we disrupted their industry? So how do you, in essence, take out a lion or take out an elephant in this context? Well, you starve it to death, right? So let's tell you, if you start taking away the revenues, you cause the disruption of industry. The thesis of this is in this Goldman Sachs report released a report, and this was actually very, very recently. They did it in March. And they said the future of finance, and this was about the lending elements of finance. And their statement was very, very simple. It was this particular year they were addressing, where they were saying 11 billion of the annual profit is immediately at risk to leave the banking system. And that's really just through the peer-to-peer lending frameworks that are coming into place. As peer-to-peer lenders emerge, they're going to lose, this year alone, they're forecasting around 7% of their revenue. So when you have an industry that's starting to lose that much of its profits that are going through, clearly that industry is starting to feel the disruption. It might be why the industries are starting to move to adopt more of these technologies in the core heart of their business. So really it's very simple. I mean, consumer lending, small business lending, leveraged loan lending, all these elements of lending are core elements of the banking networks. So once we started tracking that 65% of their revenue through them losing this interest income, the natural reaction at a moment then was to look at all the other transactional services that they've got and potentially increase those services, so make it more expensive to transfer money, more expensive to transact, and potentially more expensive to store your capital. That's why I think it's exceptionally interesting when you have a look at what a cryptocurrency transaction fees could do to an industry of that size. So we take the cryptocurrency transaction fees. Being the fact that if you were running a proper cryptocurrency network as a bank and you were really using that to move money for your customers, it could potentially be 1/200th of the charge that you could be carrying. So ultimately, this is taken from another presentation, but ultimately that transaction fees and remittances contribute, they say, about $475 billion of revenue to the banking networks, and transactional fees to kind of $150 billion. Now, when you guys are successful in running these cryptocurrency transaction mechanisms and remittances and payments, you start eating massive chunks into these pieces. So there's no real forecast at the moment as how does cryptocurrency in the context, when it gets adopted by a bank or by mainstream entities to drive their internal costs down, what is going to be the impact on the banking network? So now I can promise you that they're not going to let this revenue stream leave the banking world. But what happens when it does? You can't stop it. It is moving out that space. So peer-to-peer lenders have arrived. Cryptocurrency transactional players are gaining more and more ground, but those things happen. So what do you actually do as an exco? And we sit in this position quite regularly at the moment where we say, frankly, peer-to-peer lending and cryptocurrencies are significantly disrupting the business of banking. So what now? We're sitting on the sides. If lending revenues have dried up, and transactional fees are dried up, where are we as the bank sitting in this process today? I mean, have you guys actually, at some stage, ever thought about how complex this conversation is for a large bank to actually have with itself? I mean, it's a pretty scary situation. I mean, you're sitting there, and everybody has, they come to conferences like this, and they meet organizations like ourselves. They come out there to Stellenbosch, and they come where we're sitting. They meet guys who are showing them how currencies move from one place to the other. And you know, well, this is going to be free. We can just make it. It's going to cost like 1 cent to move the currency. They say, well, I make 16 billion rand from foreign exchange fees. So, well, you're not going to make that for much longer. Where does that logic sit? So it's very interesting for everyone in this who's in that sector, and how you can grow your businesses and how you can be successful. But largely, there are huge problems with achieving this scale. So this is where I'm going to get to the next point, is that when those banks sit around and have the conversation about what's coming at them, the question then is, disruptive innovation can hurt you, but it only hurts if you're the one if someone else is doing the disrupting, it's going to hurt you. So ultimately, the banks have to fight and have to stand up and start taking notice of what's going on in this context. We have started, we built a little careful how I put this, a currency agnostic, let me put it in this context, concept around creating the lending. We have huge regulatory frameworks around how to do the Bitcoin lending specifically. So we have plans to do an Africa-wide ability. We want to clearly have a peer-to-peer platform that works across Africa. In order to do that, it made a lot of sense for us to do it in terms of an agnostic currency, ability to go cash in and cash out, otherwise it had to be in each region. But we don't do Bitcoin just yet, no.
If someone defaults on a Bitcoin loan, what recourse can you take? It's not like that you can go and recover their other Bitcoin assets. And secondly, for me, the strengths of Bitcoin is that there's no central bank to devalue the currency by printing more money rapidly for inflation, causing inflation. And also the fact that there's a base rate interest. So if you're putting interest on Bitcoin, there's only a finite amount of Bitcoin that will ever exist. You might end up with a position where you've got more Bitcoin debt than there are Bitcoin assets, and then that's not solved the financial industry. That's just created the same problem again.
Yes, you're right, 100%. There's two issues. Let's just keep these separate from one another. When you lend something to somebody else, you have to construct a legal agreement between the two parties who've lent it to each other. What they have lent is independent of that lending agreement. So in that context, when we are doing our framework for the peer-to-peer, for the Bitcoin version of it, the legal documentation of the loan agreement would still remain the same. So I've still lent someone an item, and I expect that person to give it to me back. The issue is, so therefore, if a person defaults, you can still go to them and you can still, in essence, but what do you pursue them for? Do you ask them for more Bitcoins, or do you say, I want an equivalent of something else? I want dollars, I want the exchange rate, I want you to give me something else, I want to foreclose on something, or whatever the issue is. So in our platform, in essence, we would have, our thinking about the Bitcoin lending is that you have a legal contract, and then the instrument that people lend to each other is almost segregated from your legal agreements as you go forward. Coming to your secondary point, the interest elements. What does someone charge for the value of time? So I've now taken my capital, I've got a risk element, and I've got an inflationary element built into it. So the inflationary element from Bitcoin is kind of built into it. You can build in inflation because you've got the tracks, but the risk element is a bit more difficult. So what do you charge for it? And how do you calculate what you charge on top of it? And that has to be linked ultimately to what is the potential risk of default. So when we use it back to a consumer's risk of default in a rand-based terms, where someone has a 1 in 60 or a 1 in 50, you've got a default curve of 2% to 18%, depending on where it goes. Do you then add that in terms of a currency calculation onto that Bitcoin calculation to know what the right interest rate should be to lend at? And it became a difficult dilemma in this context. So it's nice for me to play around with. It's nice for me to concept and theorize. It's just we have to, at this stage, go forward in terms of a peer-to-peer lending platform, which is in the real-time world. Really, where we're looking at it is in around if we have the ability in each of these countries to do localized lending in the localized currencies, but allow them to transfer money to each other using the cryptocurrency world rather in that context. Yeah.
What stops Barclays Africa just putting down a Bitcoin exchange, continuing to charge real-world prices, and paying 1 cent per transaction?
But I think ultimately the point is it probably wouldn't be a Bitcoin exchange in this context. It would be a cryptocurrency exchange which has a value driven by ultimately a dollar at the background. So you still use the currency underpinning it. This is where Vinny is going is 100% right in the context. We see it as a platform. We see cryptocurrency as a platform. We don't actually, the currency is almost irrelevant. So the platform, the actual, the coding technology infrastructure of it, what it is what is beautiful about it. And that you can use that same thing to ultimately to have you to transfer currency, but just to have your own currency underpinned by a dollar in the same context. So you can, yes, exactly right, you can dramatically reduce the cost. So there are two schools of thoughts. Just use the technology to reduce the cost and keep on paying the prices high. You can do that. But never really, we can't make too much in that.
Okay. This is almost answering my question, but yeah, so the exchanges are built and they're running, they're working. Bitcoin is working as a payment method to basically teleport money anywhere, ignoring regulation and all of that. What I see happening is the incentive for banks to allow us to send money anywhere. So if you, for instance, if you've got Bitcoin, now you can make money come out of any ATM in the world, right? And that's very powerful. We didn't have that ability,
No.
a few years
So
ago.
you're 100% right. So what it allows, you mentioned one very important piece though. You mentioned the important piece around regulations. So now, the bank can't operate in outside the regulations. The big issue for the bank at the moment is it has to know where, we have this conversation. Money is the most stupid thing in the world. I mean, when you take out a coin, a rand, you hold a, it used to be a big rand. I'm looking at the whole, I'm thinking about a rand, it's bigger, it's actually like this big now, okay? When you take a rand or 5 rand, you don't know anything about it. You know where it's come from, you don't know where it's doing it, and you know where it's going, ultimately. You don't know how many are, you know nothing about it, just so that the elements. It has no train of ownership and no food and no rules associated with where it's going. But now you have the ability to do that, right? So now, in essence, the cryptocurrency world is creating an environment where money is intelligent. It kind of knows where it came from. It can know where it comes from all these steps back. And you can create some rules with these wallets, but where it's going to go based on what conditions that occur. That's extremely powerful. Actually, that could help regulators. Regulators could then really understand, okay, the money came. So long as the entry points to the system were understood. That's the big issue. So once I know the two of you, and you can transact with each other using that network for us to use as a plumbing, then we're okay from the regulatory point of view. Okay. But as soon as I don't know who you are, then I can't do it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I've got a question. For the people dealing in Bitcoin, what assurance do they take from the transaction that they're not dealing with terrorists and not participating in terrorist financing?
0.
How would you know? Because the Bitcoin is so anonymous.
But you don't know. So you don't know that they are. So you asked me, how do you...
What assurance do you
There's
want
no
to
assurance.
take?
There's
And
no assurance.
what mitigating?
We don't know who the parties are on either side. So the only way we can use it, where we legally can use it, is if we allow it to be used as our infrastructural payment network between two parties who we know who those parties are. So we know who they are, although we use this frictionless commerce transaction platform. So you know they are on an offline environment. So they have an account number with you, a registration number with you, so you know who they are, and then they use the platform to lower the costs. But in the way it's working today, you don't.
It becomes an ideal tool for terrorist financing. Not so much for money laundering, but for terrorist financing.
Well, so Silk Road and you can buy anything. That's the issue with trust. We've got to move it out of that world of the internet into the mainstream economy. That's the move that we're all busy doing. Trying to get it out of that framework into the new frameworks.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.